The idea behind this first panel, and we have people on there. We have Dave Franzen from NDSU, we have Stefan Gailans from Practical Farmers of Iowa, we have Kandel from NDSU, Matt Ruark from University of Wisconsin-Madison. And the idea behind this was that they can all share experiences from a regional perspective. And again, it's about the pursuit, not the prescription. So if you're looking in the session to get, seed 40 pounds of rye and terminate it this time and use these practices, you're probably not going to get that. But what you're going to get is a broad overview of the thought process, or why it might work, or why you could try it, or things you should keep your eye out for to make sure that you don't use up too much moisture in the spring with rye and then your soybeans set behind a growth stage. So you're going to learn the broad overview, the basics, the thought process, which is, I think, going to help you more on your farm make decisions versus the let's tell you what seeding rate, timing of seeding, and things like that.
Right. Yeah, I call it the flywheel. At least that's, from my observation, what often happens is, at the same time a farmer is trying an innovative practice, a researcher is also trying to find the data behind it, and the feedback loop that goes in between them of the data from researcher, and of course, extension and agronomists and consultants in there as well. But the feedback that goes from data to practice back to data, that's what we're trying to capture.
We have a lot of people that are in research or in extension that are listening to this, and I hope that you're not just taking information away from the research panels, but that you're also hearing what the farmers are saying on their panels about issues they're having, things they're trying, successes, failure, all those aspects, because that's going to help guide the research that we do that helps growers on the farm. So that flywheel is really appropriate for what we're doing here, is because everything is feeding back into each other to make everything stronger and better. I think there's one place that we can start from with cover crops, and that's probably after a short season crop like a small grain, like wheat, like barley, oats if you grow those. And maybe we'll go to Kandel from NDSU. What cover crops are a good fit for short season crops?
As far as what cover crop does well, I was trying to do in this video kind of a smorgasbord of options. And of course, the most logical one is to just use the seed that is already there, the spring wheat in this case, volunteered. So you have free seed. So that's probably the starting point of a mixture. And then if you can diversify in that mixture, you can seed other things in it. So the question always is, do you want to survive to the next season? Then you have to look at something that's winter hardy, for instance, winter rye. And I did a demonstration there with winter camelina as a newer crop. Those would survive the winter, and also winter wheat. So if you just look at the fall itself, then is your objective to add some nitrogen. Peas are a great crop to put in. But as already one of the questions in the chat box was, how long do you have? And that depends, of course, when you start harvesting your small grain. But typically, if we have the middle of August till the middle of September, that's 1 month. We have a little bit of frost tolerance in some of the crops, like some of the brassicas, some of the peas. Then we can extend the growing season up to maybe October. So if you want to have something that penetrates the soil more, you can maybe have some radishes. So it really always goes back to what is your main objective. And some growers may even want to graze it. So then maybe you add some of the legumes for some additional protein. So there is not a one cocktail or one species that does best. It depends really on the wishes of the producer. But there are many opportunities.
I like that idea, goal-oriented. Pick your species based on your goal. And Dave Franzen has done some work in that area too, where, looking at a diverse mix, looking at a fairly simple mix, and then also the nitrogen capture and potential release in the following year. And so maybe we'll bring Dave on to talk a little bit about his experience with cover crops after a small grain as far as nitrogen dynamics.
So some of the sites that we work with have just been the cereal, the volunteer, like Hans is saying, or made to be seeded rye if, again, you wanted it to overwinter, and then a radish. And then at another location, we did whatever the farmer wanted to do. In the first year, it was bio-strip till with field peas in rows, and then radish and a little bit of turnip and a little bit of flax, and then the volunteer winter wheat. And it was a long fall. He put these in around August 10th, and it really didn't freeze until into November. So we had, 5,000 pounds of biomass, dry biomass, and the peas were just about mature. That's the year that I really thought that if we were going to get some nitrogen release, that would be it. But maybe because the following season was kind of dry, the crop grew well, but we just didn't get any nitrogen release at all. In another year, we had in the same area, we had biostrip till with fava bean as legume instead of the field pea, and we had a little bit shorter fall. But again, the next year we had a little bit of contribution of nitrogen, but not near as much as what we thought we would. So if you're in a mix, it's really hard to predict what you're going to do. I think other researchers, Matt Ruark might have some information about what they might expect if there's a pure legume in there, and that's a lot different. But I think, you know, some people think that in order to get any kind of cycling, you need to have at least a month of growth, and I'm not sure that that's enough. Especially with the nitrate that's usually in our soils, all the legumes are going to do in that 30-day period is just drain the nitrate that's in the soil. They're really not going to contribute anything themselves with the symbiotic nitrogen fixation. So I think you have to have more than that, and that's a tough sell in the Northern Valley because if you get your small grains crop out and maybe the third week of August, trying to cross your fingers and not have a frost until October 1st is pretty tough. So I know we wouldn't have done it this year.
Those are some great points, and I think you know, we have some questions coming up here that would be a good fit for Matt if we can ask those to you. And you know, first being, how long do you need that legume cover crop growing in the fall to produce nodules? But then also, what if you have a really long fall, like Dave mentioned, you get a ton of cover crop growth, you have rye in the field, then what does that mean for nitrogen dynamics? What does that mean for carbon inputs into the soil and managing that system? So let's go to Matt for those answers.
All great questions. First off, thanks for having me. Good to be in North Dakota, even virtually. All right, so we have two separate scenarios here, right? So we have the scenario where with legumes and how much biomass needs to grow. And so that's the trick with the legumes. And we need to plant them early so you can get the biomass. So to me, the legumes are just strictly a biomass game. So once you can produce enough biomass. Now we've played around with red clover, and that'll survive the winters. So if you want to try to grow a little more nitrogen into the spring, but we've also had good success with like the crimson clovers. I heard that being discussed earlier today. Also Berseem clover, things that are winter kill in our northern climate, so you don't have to manage it again. And I think that's the nice thing. Once you get enough biomass, I guess as long as there's enough biomass and that residue starts to decompose, it decomposes quickly. So the more biomass you have, the more nitrogen release you have. So that to me is the trick. Then you go to a situation. So your second question, right, was related to how much total biomass, like with that rye, gets out of control, right? And that's is that the nature of the question?
Yeah, you plant rye, you have a long fall, you get a ton of biomass, you're freaking out going into the spring because there's so much there. And what does that mean for managing?
Yeah, and that's really the where we've seen okay, once we hit that 1 ton threshold of biomass, that's to us, that's the tipping point of that's when bad things can start to happen. So one thing is you're taking up a lot of biomass. Two, you're planting. Sometimes we see if it's corn following that rye, we see some yield suppression. So we can think about how much can you adapt. One is if you see there's that much biomass going on in the fall, should you just try to go out and terminate in the fall and not have that coverage in the spring? That's for people to decide if they want that spring coverage. A lot of places in Wisconsin, that's actually their goal. They want to have that spring coverage for those spring rains, especially for something found like a corn silage or any crop where there's not a lot of residue on the cover in the spring. So that'd be one of the trade-offs. Two is, can you harvest it? Can you take it as another silage crop? There's some potential opportunities with winter rye for that. Otherwise, the goal is those have to be your priority fields, and try to get out and get those terminated as soon as you possibly can. Move your nitrogen rate, fertilizer application up a little bit, perhaps. Make sure you've got nitrogen in the starter in your starter setup. But those can be those scenarios where bad things can happen, I suppose, in terms of agronomics. Now, the good news is you've grown a lot of carbon. It's returned if you're trying to do those soil building practices. There's a benefit if you're using it for water quality benefits. That there's a benefit there. But then we can grow too much, and then it kind of tips. We're like, maybe on the agronomic side, we see some negative things.
So we'd like to take the questions now to Stefan about, Matt had made some comments about how corn into rye is not a good idea, that there's some issues. And I know there's been quite a bit of work in Iowa on why that's not a good idea. So maybe we'll go to you to talk a little bit more about that.
Yeah, sure. As probably is known, we grow a lot of corn and a lot of soybeans in Iowa, not much else. So I'm working with a lot of growers who are trying cover crops in those systems that alternate corn and soybeans. As has been kind of mentioned here, cover crops can be really good at holding soil in place, but taking up nutrients, residual nutrients in the soil. That can sometimes spell difficulties for the corn crop the next spring, because that cereal rye residue is holding on to that nitrogen, which is what we want it to do for water quality. But it doesn't release until much later into the season. That might stunt the growth of an early corn seedling and rob it of yield potential. So we've actually tried some trials with farmers who are compared kind of our rule of thumb, which is to terminate the cereal rye cover crop 10 to 14 days ahead of planting corn. And they compared that to planting green, which involves planting a cash crop directly into a living cover crop or a freshly killed cover crop. And I'd say in about 2/3 to 75% of those instances, those strip trials on farms across Iowa, we have seen yield loss to the corn compared to where the farmer abided by that rule of thumb, terminating 10 to 14 days ahead of time. For the most part, we are chalking that up to early season nitrogen deficiency for the corn, which stunted its growth, stunted its development, and resulted in some lost bushels in the field. The case with soybeans, we see the exact opposite. When farmers are planting green, they're seeing no yield loss, and some are anecdotally reporting better soybean yields. But we have also shown in some of our strip trials across the state from the last few years that farmers may be able to get away with less passes for weed control in the soybean year because of the amount of cover crop growth, stunting weeds, but not stunting soybean development and yield potential.
Great, and that's a lot of what we're seeing here too, which is great to see those commonalities amongst within a region. And so maybe let's go. There's so many questions up here. My eyes are a little bit kind of cross-eyed because we're going to save some of these for sessions later. And but there's a question coming up now. If we're looking at these, cover crops, planting green into a cover crop, what that means for the green bridge for cover crops and building some of the disease or pest problems. And let's go to Hans for that one. Is there any concerns that we may have about disease and pest transfer when using cover crops?
Well, if you think about the cereals, there could potentially be a bridge between, the spring wheat, the rye being green and then going for a next grain plot. Now, when we think about the other issues, I'm thinking more about diseases that we have to be considering. For instance, with the brassicas, if you have those in a canola system, that is a no-no because we can have clubroot in the brassicas. So if you have a canola and a brassica in that rotation, that could potentially increase those situations. So that is, also kind of a bridge from one disease to the next one. So the other thing that came to mind is not a disease, but it's actually something maybe good. If you plant green, in our northern region, we have a lot of iron chlorosis. And if you plant soybeans into a green crop, the green crop probably has taken out a little bit more nitrates, and therefore it's probably going to benefit the soybean. So there is an indirect effect of the nitrate taken up by the green crop for soybeans. So there's a couple things that quickly come to mind.
So there's a lot of little intricacies that happen when using cover crops and how to make sure you manage those. And one of those intricacies is having a cover crop use too much moisture and what happens in that situation. This really takes us out to the western part of North Dakota, really, more arid region, as to how could you use cover crops in a more arid region without using too much moisture. And Dave, you're a road warrior. I see you're out in western North Dakota a lot, so maybe we'll go to you for this question.
Yes, we had a really dry year in 2019, even here in the East, and I fully understand the value of water in the West. I mean, from time to time there's a really wet year, but that's really not the nature of anything west of Carrington. So, in this really dry year, we had the two sites that are in our big cover crop research. One site was in long-term no-till field at Tilmonies, and you've seen, I think, Anthony's work before on the soil sense, and it was just as dry there as it was in the transitional no-till site up at the Share Farm up north by New Rockford, Northwood, in that area. So you would think that they would respond the same, but I think because of Anthony's mulch or groundwater, the cover crops were sustained, and we had some pretty nice yields at Valley City after our barley. But up north, it was really poor establishment. It was on a landscape, and in the higher landscapes where it was drier, the take of the cover crops was a lot less germination. And when it got down into the little darker soils, then the germination was better, but the biomass was still, 25% of what it was at Valley City. We've also had drier years in some of our studies, and when we had camelina at Gardner in that valley soil, the really high clay soil, you would think that it would survive some water stress, but it really put some stress on some soybeans growing that year. And so if I was a farmer and I had a spring like that and saw what the camelina was doing to the dryness of the soil, I would have terminated it earlier rather than later. I think just being aware and knowing that you're going to manage the thing instead of just letting it grow until you plant. You have to keep your eyes open and use some common sense when you have cover crops in the West.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. We know that cover crops aren't something you can just plant and forget and think it's going to be a silver bullet without that management. Let's go. There's another question on this interseeding cover crops and small grains. And Matt, you talked about that a little bit in your video with broadcasting some clovers into small grains. And what kind of information do you have or data do you have on that to share?
So for clovers and small grains, I really like the red clover. It gives you gives you that extra option if you. Here's why I like red clover. Red clover knows its role, so you can get it going in the understory, and it doesn't try to overachieve. And that kind of holds true for any sort of interseeding into other crops as well. Other crops that keep trying to grow, no, red clover just gets going and hangs out. And so when we go, what we like to do is we have this practice. We like to frost seed, where we go in March, maybe early April. The snow's off the ground, but some dry conditions, a little bit of cracking in that soil surface. Then we're going to broadcast the seed and hopefully use that little cracking to get some good seed soil contact. Then we've had really good success year after year in getting good establishment. And then by the time we take that weed off, we've got that red clover ready to go. The other value of this that we like is then we can grow so much biomass in the fall that we actually just go ahead and terminate the red clover at the end, like in early October. We've grown so much nitrogen that we don't need to worry about letting it grow into the spring and we don't need to be too greedy, so we can terminate it, and we get these really great responses in terms of nitrogen supply to that next corn crop. So that's been a real great success. Of course, the trick is like getting out there and getting that right timing down of the application. So that's really been our biggest success. Although outside of red clover, I haven't tested any other interseeded legumes into small grains.
In the olden days, we used, establishing alfalfa, and you used a small grain crop as a nurse crop. So that's kind of the same principle.
Hans, are there any options for seeding a small grain green? Are there any places to do that, or any I don't know, any merit to that idea?
So you're talking about having a cover crop and then going into it with a small grain.
Yeah.
I don't know if that is done. What I did do is I had cover crops growing, and then I terminated them just at the time of planting spring wheat. And what we saw in that case is that if the rye was a little bit aggressive growing in the spring, we actually had a negative effect on the wheat yield. So that was then the one that could be planted green. So if I would have let it go further, it would have been disastrous for the spring wheat. So depending on what crop you use, if it was like camelina, which is a different crop, you might be able to plant green, but I don't think anybody has really looked at that.
Stefan, could fertilizing nitrogen with the planter alleviate yield drag from early season nitrogen tie-up?
Definitely. The farmers who are planting, who despite what other people are seeing, they feel comfortable planting their corn green, are certainly having success by putting on maybe 30 to 60 units of nitrogen with the planter in the row, and also having their planter set up such that they're getting good depth control and good covering of the seed furrow, so that corn seed has good seed to soil contact, gets that early moisture and that early nitrogen, and can get up and outcompete some of that early season nitrogen deficiency that the rye is conveying. Definitely that putting on nitrogen fertilizer with the planter would be recommended, maybe even regardless of you're planting green or not. I'm hearing a lot of farmers around here, state of Iowa, that are really transitioning towards that for success. Not necessarily putting on more nitrogen than they typically would, just kind of changing the timing of their nitrogen program. The number of units of N staying the same, but having to kind of get their mind around some different application passes such that the corn can be successful in that situation.
Gears a little bit too, or stay on the same path. I feel like we're jumping all over the place because there's so many great questions. There's a lot of great information here. Let's talk a little bit more about planting green of soybean into rye, and what are some of the key things that you just need to be watching for to make sure that this is a success. So let's go back to Stefan for that, because I know you really think that this is a great practice for your area, and we think it's great for up here too.
Sure. I guess just like I mentioned with the planter setup for corn, having if you have a planter or drill, the disc's got to be sharp to cut through residue, to get depth control of the seed, and to get it covered up again. There's no golden rule for what implement or piece of equipment that is. It's just, can you get the seed in the ground to the depth that you want and get it covered? Guys and gals have different setups. Whatever you're comfortable with, go with that, as long as you can get it to what it needs to do. There's been a lot of discussion recently in terms of planting soybeans green as to, should you plant into a fresh or a still living cover crop and then terminate a few days later, or should you maybe terminate a day or two before and it's starting to just kind of come to die and plant? Anymore, the guys and gals that I work with and are using this successfully, they prefer to plant while it is still living. And the reason they are reporting that is that they feel that their drill or their planter can move through that living cover crop much better than if it's starting to flop over and get a little raggedy, and they might have plugging when it's starting to dry and brown up. Whereas a living cover crop is still kind of standing up. Those row units can move through that a little better so that they don't plug. They can cut through the cover crop in the soil, get good depth control, and cover up that furrow again. So those are some of the keys and tips that farmers that are using it successfully here in Iowa with soybean production are reporting when planting soybeans into a green cover crop, and especially a green cover crop by mid-May here in Iowa. That's getting to be chest shoulder high, so that's a lot of biomass. That, of course, then is out competing some early season weeds, might also keep the soil temperature at a better level later in the summer and preserve some moisture if we get hot and dry, and helping the soybean crop out that way into August and September.
I like we're kind of moving through a rotation here, and maybe I've finally gotten my groove. So I apologize to the panel, but if you, okay, so you plant the soybean green into rye, and then you come in, and is there a space or an opportunity to broadcast a cover crop into soybean to get it in on the back end of soybean? And let's go to Hans for that, because I know you had some field trials on that.
Yeah, so that is always the question. Can you establish still a cover crop after a soybean crop? So then you kind of talk about relay cropping. So we did a couple of experiments at timing, but also row spacing and the maturity of the soybean. So let me just kind of summarize that it can be done, probably broadcasting seed at the time when, you know, the lower leaves of the soybean start to senesce, yellowing. So we are transitioning from a full canopy to an opening of the canopy. So that would be possible, but because our season is kind of pushing the limits, often that takes place maybe in September. So we are kind of late in that opportunity. So the other question then is, oh, well, what if you compare, you know, row spacing? So if you go with 12-inch row spacing versus 24, 24 would be a more open canopy. Can you, you know, go in a little earlier? Well, you can go in a little bit earlier, but you're giving up some yield potential if you have wider rows than narrow rows. So if you look at the economics, so that choice is, you know, if your planter is set up for wider rows, you know, that is a benefit. And then the question was, oh, if you go with an earlier maturing soybean, will that help? Because they will start to senesce quicker, and then you have more time on the clock. And yes, you will get more biomass. And yes, the next spring there is more biomass, but the yield of the earlier maturing was, you know, quite a bit lower than one that is kind of adapted to the maturity of a region. So we're giving up some bushels just by the maturity selection. So in other words, it can be done, and then probably you look at the end of the season, you know, when we start to senesce, yellowing of the beans on the bottom, and the canopy starts to open. That's probably the best. And you know, we still have some work to do, but the time is very short, and the amount of biomass that we actually produce then in the fall is very limited.
Okay, so thank you for that, Hans. If we kind of keep moving through this rotation, we've decided that we shouldn't maybe seed, you know, plant corn into rye, not without some extra nitrogen fertilizer applications, or splitting up the timing of the fertilizer applications for corn. What if we want to interseed corn? What are the options there, and how well does that work in this region? And let's go back to Matt for that, because you had some interseeding information in your video.
So interseeding is tricky. That's my answer. No.
Perfect.
So, I mean, we've done a lot of, there's been a lot of experimental work, like, will it grow? And I generally liked, anything will grow for a certain amount of time. And this gets back to, Hans's point of like, what's the goal here? And so we've struggled with getting good success and establishment of grass crops interseeded into corn. My angle has been like, these legumes are great because they'll supply nitrogen. And if you have, so in Wisconsin, we do have a fair amount of land that's corn into corn. So if we can grow some legumes in that corn phase, and then maybe it could supply nitrogen in that next phase. And so but again, it's that same trick where the red clover always establishes well. It tends to establish a little bit better than we've seen than the other ones, and it'll survive, right? And so after the corn harvest, if there's a little bit of growth at the end of the season, maybe there is, maybe there isn't, then it'll put on a little bit of biomass. But the trick with that, though, it's not enough biomass. So we have to let it grow into the spring to get enough biomass to get the benefit. And then it just becomes what are the weather conditions in the spring? So we've had some years with great success and we grew a fair amount of biomass and it supplied some nitrogen, but other years where it never really thickened up, never really got a lot of biomass to supply that nitrogen. So we're still at the mercy of the weather patterns, especially in the spring.
And Dave, with your experience of interseeding corn here in North Dakota, what have been your successes or failures too with interseeding?
So in our rotations in our work, we had soybeans after corn, and so the nitrogen benefit really wasn't a big deal. But the idea was to just get get some kind of growth after corn, for people that wanted some kind of a, well, serve two purposes. One is a catch crop for the nitrogen that might be left over after the corn, and the other for just building up organic matter, or speeding the transition to what we would call full-blown real-time no-till. So in almost every year, we used an interseeder that actually put the seed in the ground, and almost all the years we were pretty successful doing that. And we had a couple of years that were pretty dry, and I was worried about it. And the first time that it happened, it was a really dry summer, and so I really expected that where we had the cover crop rye and the radish, that we would have a yield decline, and we didn't see even a whiff of it. And so I think what's happening, and we're still working on trying to nail down if this is what's happening or not, but the rye and the radish, when you're interseeding, and we did it, what, V6 to V8, somewhere in that time frame, it's small, not really competitive, it's kind of ferny leaf. And so I think whenever there's a dew, the cover crop is acting like a dew catcher. And for those of you science fiction people out there, you know, I pretend I'm Dr. Kynes, the planetologist on Dune. So I think that's happening. We're yet to prove it, but it makes sense to me. You would think that something that is alive and growing during a dry year would hold back the corn yields, and it just doesn't seem to do that. So there has to be something going into the system that's offsetting the use of the cover crops, because they're not growing in no water. They're using some water, not very much, but when it's dry, anything is something.
I think we've gone through the rotation, right? Tim, tell me if I'm staying on track here.
This is great. I'm enjoying learning.
Abby, can I interject one more system?
Please do.
Yeah, so I don't know if you in another panel are going to talk about sunflower and cover crops, but as we're talking about interseeding, actually with sunflowers, it's slightly different than with corn, because the way the plant is growing, first of all, when you look at the season, it starts to grow slowly, and then you have a full canopy where you have only about 10% light. But then as soon as the head is formed, the lower leaves start to die off on the sunflower, and the amount of light increases. So sunflower has more light in the end of the season into the canopy than corn. So growing cover crops, I've done some experiments on those. If you plant cover crop at the V4, then initially it is what Matt was saying, hanging in there, it is growing, but it is not doing anything. But then after the bloom of the sunflower, more light starts to penetrate, and the cover crop actually can benefit from that light. So the amount of biomass you can produce in interseeding in sunflower is probably more than you ever will get from interseeding in corn.
This will be great too, because we'll talk tomorrow also about widening those corn rows and what that means for cover crops, and also corn yield and your end goals for that practice. So if you're starting to think, okay, I want to interseed, I'm not sure if the light is there, how I'm going to do this is survivability, we may have some answers for you tomorrow as well. But I'd like to know, you know, as we look through these practices, and Stefan, you have a program that's built around farmers and them trying things on their farm. And how do they know if it's working? How do you know what to recommend to farmers based on what you're seeing in the field?
First, I'll mention, I think it was either in the chat or Q&A, that a lot of farms and fields are different, and a lot of farmers' goals are different. So what I do with my colleagues at Practical Farmers of Iowa is that we help our farmers kind of tease out the questions or goals that they have on their farm. And for a lot of them, we help them set up basic research experiments that compare practice A to practice B. So maybe it's a cover crop versus no cover crop, or 2 termination dates of the cover crop, or 2 species of cover crop. And we help them just kind of set out a plan for making observations, recording data, recording info about their field, and working with them through the year and to the end of the year to write up a report of that basic experience. It's actually what my team and I are doing right now. We've got our big research meeting next week, where a lot of our farmer scientists, our cooperators, as we'll call them, they're going to gather and share their their results, their observations from the year, and use that to build trials for the next year and years to come. So it's really about fostering their own personal curiosities and challenges, and then sharing it amongst each other, but then also sharing it with their neighbors and colleagues and other farmers. But it's, you guys were mentioning that flywheel concept in the preamble to this session. It's about building that kind of progress and improvement on a farm, but however that farmer defines it for him or herself. So that's how we kind of help people figure out, does this work or doesn't it? Might work for him, doesn't work for me. Might work for her, doesn't work for me. Or maybe it works for both of us, but in a little different way. And it's up to us to kind of figure that out and then tell people, here's how we went about figuring that out. We had a stepwise process.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to that thought process and figuring things out for your own farm. And oftentimes we see, and you'll hear this later in the farmer panel, that some of those decisions are made not even just by a farmer for his whole farm, it's by field, and that variability and those things kick in for different goals for different fields. And so assigning that goal into why you want to use cover crops in the first place is key, as was pointed out. And Dave, I know you've got some ideas too for infield assessment on how things are looking, especially if you're trying to get to that point where you're starting to back off a little bit on fertilizer, and are you losing yield in doing that because you're relying on too much, or relying too much on release from a cover crop. And so can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so we have a bunch of growers and people from quite a wide area right now. And so even if we didn't, even if it was just in the state and the region, I would recommend this. So let's say that you have a pretty good cover crop growth. Maybe it includes some legumes or mostly legumes, and you really think that you're going to get some nitrogen benefit the next year. And let's say that your normal fertilizer rate would be maybe 150 pounds of N pre-plant for whatever crop you're going to grow. And you think you're going to get maybe 40 pounds of N benefit from that cover crop. Well, go ahead, when you put your base rate of N down, go ahead and put that 110 pounds of N on. But then in this strip, about the width of an applicator, maybe 100 feet long or something, someplace where you can watch it, put that extra 40 pounds on. Put that 150 pounds on. And if you're going by there in the season, early in the season, and it looks just as green on the strip as it does in the rest of the field, then you've made the right choice, and you can stop worrying about it. But if that strip is greener than the 110 you put on the rest, then that means that you overestimated how much N you're going to get from that cover crop, and you need to go in and supplement it.
That makes sense. In-field assessment, going field by field, watching what's happening, making sure that you're not getting caught with reduced yield in some scenarios. Let's see, we've got some questions that we are going to move to a later session. So a good mix for interseeding sunflowers. We have another session later on specialty crops. Some of the widening row on sunflowers, we'll move that down to that session. So we want to make sure that we're not ignoring your questions, but we are going to address them later. Trying to think here.
I'm kind of drawn to some of the random questions. I don't know if you don't mind, because something I guess personally hadn't thought of is drainage tile and deep-rooted cover crops. I mean, is there any risk in deep-rooted cover crops actually affecting drainage tile? And Matt, I don't know if this is anything you've looked at, but you're up there in Wisconsin, all that water. I'm wondering if that's something you've ever seen.
Well, interestingly, we actually don't have that much tile drainage in Wisconsin. Iowa might have some more information. So, but I guess the cases where I've heard about it were in central and southern Indiana. So maybe it's a case where it's putting on that big biomass, but we haven't really seen that issue in Wisconsin, in the northern parts. But I don't know. Maybe Stefan, you've seen some stuff.
Yeah, Stefan, is that anything that's happened in Iowa that you've seen?
That was a concern about 4 or 5 years ago, and I haven't heard anything since. I remember it getting, and maybe Matt, I remember maybe it came out of Indiana, or there was some legitimate concern about it, right? There was some articles published or some chatter about that. But talking to the guys and gals that I work with and the farmers around Iowa, we're not getting a lot of complaints about that or concerns about that. But it was in the chatter box 4 or 5 years ago. I'll admit that.
Yeah, no, that was a good point. Yeah, I haven't heard anything recently.
So I know it's a little bit anecdotal, but logically, there's quite a few tile drain acres here in the valley and in Sugar Beet country. And those roots go down 10, 12 feet. And those fields are fine. So that hasn't been a problem. If it's not a problem in sugar beet production, it can't possibly be a problem in cover crops.
Yeah, I have been measuring the water table, and oftentimes the water table is during the season below the tile line. So if there's no water in the tile, why would the root grow to the tile line? It wouldn't. So most of the times there is not an issue. I have had tile in for about 10 years. I've not seen any issue.
So as we're selecting a cover crop mix in the end, right? I mean, if we're not worried that it's going to plug some tile lines, or how much diversity do we need in that mix to really be effective? Or is there such a thing as having too many things in a mix that could actually cause problems? And who should we go to for this? I think, should we go back to Hans, since you've been doing some of the different mixes and numbers of species and mixes?
Yeah, so I'm kind of thinking about it as a mimicking of nature. And if you look at most of the area in the northern part of the US was prairie, right? And if you look at the prairie landscape, it was very diverse. So there's nothing against diversity. So I think the question remains then, okay, cost, what can you afford and what are the cheaper ones? Well, the cheapest one would be the volunteer that is already growing. And then the grains are kind of cheap. And then this morning, one of the panel members or questioners was saying, what about flax or some grass seeds? So you can have quite a mixture. But then if you have certain if your objective is to put nitrogen, yes, you have to put some legumes in it. But if you put legumes in a mix, that means that there's only a percentage of your field that has a legume. So if you go back to the early discussion that nitrogen is related to the total biomass, if it is just a small percentage of your cover percent, then you're not going to add that much nitrogen. If you talk about deep-rooted radishes, those have a special function. But I would say my experience is if you put a cocktail together and you put the same cocktail on 2 different fields, 3 different fields, 3 different seasons, at the end, and you evaluate what is growing there, you will come to the conclusion that every time the combination of which plants are dominant will be different. So my take on it is let the plants decide which one is the best environment, and just have a mixture available as long as it is cheap enough so that it doesn't cost too much.
We're at about 5 minutes left on this panel, and so we're going to leave it open-ended for the last round, and we'll go to each of the 4 of them. Just anything else that you'd like to add, either emphasize in our discussion or add to it before we end this panel, and we'll start with Matt.
To my surprise, I was reading through the comments, so it looks like there's a lot of comments about clover, and maybe probably more local information is needed in North Dakota related to red clover. A lot of comments about maybe not catching, doesn't overwinter very well. So so the trick is, yeah, what else? I mean, I think then what are the other options outside of red clover? Certainly red clover has been one of the more popular ones, but I do like these other playing around with the legumes. I think is probably the more perhaps short-term rewarding cover crop. If we can figure out how to get the legumes to grow in these crop rotations and supply some nitrogen. But maybe it's not red clover. Maybe it is crimson clover. Maybe it's berseem clover. Maybe there's some other popular clovers in the maybe for the western side of the state. So I guess I'm what gets me the most excited about evaluating cover crops is trying to get the use of legumes in rotation, because it does have that short-term economic benefit of supplying some nitrogen. So do we have that dialed in? Not quite necessarily, in all the regions. And if I could just make one more comment, there was a lot of comments about, well, do you get the nitrogen back with these grass cover crops? And Dr. Franzen answered a question on that. And the trick is, if you can keep growing these grasses year after year after year, the nitrogen has to go somewhere, right? So it's not, assuming that it's not just slowly leaching out over time, so you're going to have that potential buildup of organic matter in soil, but it's a long-term game. And then in a perfect world, we'd also be building up these organic nitrogen pools. And the problem that we're having right now, or maybe it's not necessarily a problem, but the big research area that a lot of people are working on is, what's that best measurement? Maybe it's not the entire soil organic matter measured through loss on ignition. Maybe it's a pool of organic carbon or nitrogen that'll help us know that we've built up these levels in soils, and maybe there'd be an opportunity to cut back on nitrogen fertilization. So right now we don't have anything ready for prime time, but ultimately that would be some of the thought process of when would you get the nitrogen back. With the grasses, it's probably going to be many, many years in the future, but it's a long-term game for soil improvement.
Thank you, Matt, very much for that. Stefan, let's let you get a final word in here.
I think something that's overlooked is when it comes to diversity is diversity in time can also be something to strive for. So whether that's extending our crop rotations to 1 or 2 more crops than we currently grow, excuse me, or using crop rotation we currently have and adding a cover crop. Each of those is adding diversity. So we can get kind of really enthused and wild about these cover crop mixes or cocktails. But sometimes that can spin out of control. So diversity in time, sometimes ignored, but shouldn't be, in my opinion.
And let's go to Hans for a final thought.
Yeah, so what we have not talked about is that there are other crops in North Dakota that have a fairly short season. I'm thinking about lentils or canola or field peas. And we can also think about putting cover crops after those crops. And then especially with the field peas, the volunteer field peas actually seem to be nodulating even better than the first crop that you grow in a field. So something to consider if you have grown field peas, just to work the ground lightly and have the volunteer pea part of your cover crop mix.
Thanks so much, Hans. And Dave, for a final word.
Yeah, so I wasn't going to talk about this, but I'm going to talk about this. So it's really interesting that people have had really bad luck with red clover here in the state, and it's surprised me a little bit because back in 1910, around the Hillsborough area, there's about a 2,000 acre plus farm, which is huge back in the day, that all they did was produce red clover seed, and they sold it through the whole region. And then before too long, alfalfa came back and it became king, and so nobody grows it anymore. But I don't think it's like nobody grows it. I think, remembering back in the certified crop and certified seed publication, that there are still 1 or 2 red clover people around. So maybe the reason red clover isn't very winter hardy around here is we're buying seed from Arkansas or someplace. So if we were buying seed from somebody up here that actually raised North Dakota seed, that maybe it actually would do something. So I just want to throw that out, that in the past, red clover was king in North Dakota.
What a fascinating panel.
Yeah, there's a lot of information, and I really appreciate all of your expertise. Yeah. And looking at this from a regional scale, I think we've learned a lot about the intricacies of how things may work in different areas and what's being recommended. But I think you guys made some great points at the end of just these kind of common themes or things that you're thinking of I like the diversity over time. You don't have to cram all that diversity into one shot. You can spread it out over time and use your rotation as part of that diversity. And I think that's a great point in making things goal oriented. What do you want to do with your cover crops? And then custom tailoring them to fit that goal is pretty critical. And then looking for those short season crops in rotation as opportunities to include cover crops. So those are the primary things I took away.